All right, welcome guys to another video discussion on Ballantine's classic library of science fiction. I'm joined again by Richard at Vintage SF and Ira at SF Words of Wonder. Our last video was Fritz Leiber, and that video was on Richard's channel, and that was a good chat. And this time we are going to talk about Gallun, Richard Gallun, or Raymond Gallun. But first, as always, we kind of have like an icebreaker question. And uh, lately, like I noticed, the more I read older science fiction, like early and mid 20th century stuff, I just it appealed to me more and more. And I'm I wouldn't say losing interest in newer stuff, but it's not as appealing the more I read this older stuff. And so, because this particular collection really took me by surprise and I really enjoyed it, I just thought I'd ask you guys what draws you to older science fiction, older, early, mid 20th century science fiction? Ira?
Yeah, so I guess some of the first stories I kind of read that I guess almost like around the Golden Age or predated were some Edgar Rice Burroughs, some of Asimov's early stuff. And there was something about it that just kind of drew me to it. But as I kind of read more and more, I kind of lean away a little bit from the pulpier side of that era. But this book really surprised me, even though it has some of the pulp elements. Gallun was doing some really interesting things in this one. So this was definitely a standout for something that was written. Most of these stories were written in like the 30s and the 40s. But another thing that I've noticed is there was like, it seemed like there was definitely a sense of community back then between the authors and the publishers and the editors and even the fans. And there was this conversation that was going on. And I think that is one thing that's kind of not around as much anymore. I think booktube is kind of our way of maybe reenacting that, but um, it seems like that it's got so I don't, I'm speaking really broadly. I know there's good works of science fiction still being published, but it seems very commercialized, very corporate in a way. And I think a lot of people have just kind of maybe run out of really good ideas and it's gotten harder to come up with original content and stuff. But that's kind of my thoughts, I guess. I do like reading everything. And lately too, I have been drawn a little bit into the new wave of science fiction, from the 60s and the 70s. But I still think some of my favorite stories come out of the golden age or before.
Richard?
Well, it says it in my name, Vintage SF. That was a focus of my channel when I got started. But I guess, how do you define vintage? At the time I started, I was thinking about 1985 and earlier. But I got drawn more and more, especially once I started looking at short stories, to things that were, say, 1965 and earlier. I've read a lot of novels that come from after 1965, but when it came to short stories, that seemed to be earlier. And I think it's because of the pulp magazines, the science fiction magazines. That was the major market for science fiction writers all the way up to around 1950. And then in 1950, all of a sudden, they started publishing more and more paperbacks. There definitely had been some novels published prior to that, but all of a sudden, there was a glut of work, collections of stories or fix-up novels that came out in the 50s and 60s, and it became a market because of people like Asimov and Heinlein and Clark became a profitable place to create novels. So there was a switch from short story, primarily based fiction, to novels and still continuing with short stories. Often that's where writers got their first start, with short stories and then moving into the novels. So once I started reading some of the best of collections, once I started reading some of the older science fiction stories, there's an appeal to them. There is something about people discovering for the first time or having an attitude that hadn't been used before. I think of Gallun really having a maybe four is not the right word, having an attitude that was more contemporary to us way back in the 1930s. And so I find his writing amazing because it feels like a contemporary story, not something set in the 1930s. And so discovering people like that is really exciting. And obviously doing this with you, I think that the best ofs were published in the 70s. I think it was somewhere in the mid to late 70s, these books were published. And they had the best of that period. And often the author was still alive. And as we'll see today, there was an afterword by that author. So it really was a amazing opportunity to um, collect and remember writers from that time period. So I think our focus too on the best of has really encouraged me to enjoy those stories as well.
Right. So my experience has been strange. When I started reading science fiction, it was more contemporary stuff. And ever since, especially since I created a booktube channel, I've progressively been more interested in older and older stuff. And partly I might be romanticizing the past. Like I like history anyways. And, you know, when you're reading stuff written by people where there's hardly any interviews by some of these authors, there's hardly any pictures of them, it gives them this mystery, but also the fact that like I love tropes in my science fiction, but I also like reading kind of the beginnings of such tropes, the first ideas, kind of like you said, like people coming up with ideas sometimes for the first time, uh, which we don't see a lot in contemporary stuff. I mean, if you read hard SF, there's always new stuff, but I mean, ideas. Um, I don't know. I think I really have a tendency to romanticize people and time periods of the past, and it's almost like the more you read into the history, it's like archaeology of some sort. You're learning more about the genre, and I think I'm just becoming really interested in not just older SF, but history as well. Um, and so I've started collecting like reference books and stuff, and that's a whole other area of interest I never expected to to fall into. But um, maybe when you read a specific genre long enough, it's inevitable that you're going to get curious. But yeah, I just find myself so drawn to the older stuff, and now to interviews of those people. And like Ira said, like lots of these authors were in touch with one another, and there's old interviews and stuff with them. It's great. Um, so yeah, it's strange to like reading stories of the future written in the past. And it's cool when you meet an author like Gallun, who almost seemed prescient sometimes. Uh, and you know, to kind of connect with somebody from that long ago, I don't know. It's really taken me by surprise, my SF journey, and the best ofs are just helping that blossom into areas I never expected. And Gallun has certainly once again captured my sense of wonder, which a lot of these older authors managed to do. So yeah, should we move on to Raymond Gallun, an author none of us had, I believe, any experience with. I've since realized he's in a bunch of my anthologies and some of my magazines, but I had never actually read him. So, and I'm guessing at the time, like the mid to late 70s, when these best ofs were being put together, arguably Raymond Gallun was maybe the least known of these authors. At least that seems to be the case to me. There's lots of these best of authors I haven't read, but I'm well aware of them. But I don't know if that would still be the case today if he's the least recognized of these best ofs, the 21 or so authors that we're going to read. But I'm just surprised I hadn't come across him, or at least the significance of his work to the genre. So he was born in 1911 in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin, and died in 94 in New York. And he first started having his stories published in the pulps in 1929. And he was known for kind of pushing boundaries. His stories involved biology and kind of a lot of Darwinian evolution and emphasizing species and worlds that made some sort of scientific plausibility, which, was just kind of maybe becoming a new thing in the pulps in the early 30s. Not a lot of people were doing it, at least not that I've read. And the introduction by J.J. Pierce here, J.J. Pierce calls him a revolutionary, which right off the bat got me very excited, because I'm thinking, I don't know anything about this author, but already he's apparently a big deal. And in the introduction, where is it? Pierce says, few realize that Gallun was one of 3 men, along with John W. Campbell and Stanley G. Weinbaum, who did most to set in motion the evolution of SF from crude pulp fiction to a form increasingly imaginative and literate, which got me excited instantly. And his stories often encourage like empathy, caution, and reason, and his desire for like plausible technology and otherworldly life and worlds marks him as, in my admittedly underread opinion, like an early pioneer of hard science fiction, which I didn't expect going into this collection. And he even says in his afterword here, I'm just going to read a little part he mentions here. He says, I rated facts higher than imagining, yet when facts were missing, there had to be something plausible to take their place and relieve a stress, which I just find that exciting, that he was kind of on a mission to raise the quality or the plausibility of scientific stories. But his first, like I said, he started publishing stories in 1929. But his first major story that earned him recognition, and the one he's most known for, is Old Faithful, which is the first story in this collection. And that was published in 1934. But in July of 34, Stanley Weinbaum, his story, A Martian Odyssey, was published in Wonder Stories. And this was kind of a big landmark, and kind of considered a turning point in SF, as it featured like an alien creature that wasn't evil or hell-bent on, dominating the Earth, but instead it was, friendly and helpful to the human protagonist. But similar to that, which I found pretty fascinating, was that Old Faithful was published just 5 months later in Astounding Stories, and it also became associated with a shift in SF's perception of, otherworldly creatures. But this time, we not only have like a friendly, non-threatening alien, but we actually have a point of view with the character. And, we get to empathize and sympathize with something he ended up doing a lot, at least in these stories, with his alien characters that end up having more humanity sometimes than the humans. And Lester Del Rey, in my kind of a science fiction history he compiled of early science fiction, he actually commented on Old Faithful as a story that had an unusual emotional power with readers. So, he's kind of a landmark in the genre, and I never knew anything about it. He won a few awards throughout his career, but one of note was the Icon Award, given for a lifetime of achievement in the genre of science fiction. And this was from the Science Fiction Forum, which is a group out of Stony Brook University in New York. But the cool thing is, 2 years after that, they renamed the award the Gallun Award. And for the next 20 years, they gave an award out to not necessarily an author, sometimes it was an editor, but somebody who made an impact in the genre. And as far as I could tell, the last award was given to Ursula K. Le Guin in 2007. And that's all I got. He's become someone I've started researching and become kind of mildly fascinated by.
Same here.
World traveler, and yeah. So, yeah, I'm hoping you guys were as taken aback as I was, or at least pleasantly surprised.
100%. Yeah, it's been my favorite of the best ofs that we've done so far. And I don't know if it was just because I didn't have any expectations.
Yeah, that could be. I thought maybe I was getting, I don't want to say a dud, but I thought I was getting maybe something out of the way that might not be as good as some of our previous reads, but I did not expect to be so taken aback.
Yeah, and like you said, with the afterword that he wrote, just his mindset, I could really relate to the guy as a person, and you could read it in the stories, and then he's explaining kind of the background of some of that. And like you said, he was a world traveler. He worked in a hemp factory when he was a kid. I mean, he did all these different things, and I liked that. I even highlighted that section about using as much hard science fiction or hard science as you could, and where you have to fill in the gaps, make it as plausible as possible, staying away from like the fantasy. And that's just kind of like my favorite kind of science fiction. So,
and it's crazy that he just was kind of not maybe trying to make a change, but he's kind of trying to uplift the genre, maybe unknowingly or something. There's got to be other people who were putting some hard SF into their writing in the pulp era, but this is the first I've come across, I think, that's this good. So I was completely taken aback, just like I was when I read C.L. Moore and thought, I can't believe somebody was writing this poetic and this great in pulp magazines.
yeah. Yeah,
Well,
and one thing I should say, a lot of these best ofs we've read have a lot of psionics, and he didn't bring
Yes.
up psionics at all, I don't think, right? In this? Was there?
Subtle
There was like,
mind control, sort of, or
yeah, I
more like
think that it was a little different the way he approached
coercion.
it.
Yeah, that was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah,
I don't totally mind it, but it was nice to not have, a bunch of mind control and stuff.
yeah.
yeah, I think there's one story that the Martians themselves kind of had a bit of a communication that way, that they didn't have a verbal communication, but it wasn't something that was human.
Yeah, although, well, not that species. It is interesting. A lot of his aliens have human characteristics, but we'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah.
And then
I was going to say,
Oh.
I kept thinking these stories are all 80 to 90 years old to us. And I felt like I was reading something that could be published today and people wouldn't blink an eye. It would be difficult for them to guess that was
Right.
printed that, or that was published that long ago. And I also
Except
thought,
for there's one guy whose sidekick is named Muggsy. And that kind of dated it for me. But it was good.
you don't know any Muggsies?
I don't know any Muggsies.
And I don't know if we'll get to one of these stories, but apparently he came up with one of the first like nanotechnology stories.
Yeah,
We read that, we see that all the time. I read it and thought, oh, that's cool. And then when I looked up some stuff on it, apparently that was maybe one of the first ones.
As well as bioengineering. I don't know if I've read earlier, like at least detailed or trying to be plausible bioengineering and stuff.
Yeah.
I also just wanted to mention that I think he was Golden Age before there was Golden Age. A lot of people define Golden Age as 1939. John W. Campbell takes over Astounding Magazine as editor, and then his editorship launches the Golden Age. Well, probably half these stories were written before that, and he did contribute to Astounding Magazine. So if you're trying to understand what his stories were like, they were in that mold where you had as plausible science as possible being integral to the story. And I would say that was his strength. Sometimes dialogue and characters to me felt a little bit more stilted, but I did enjoy the plotting as well.
And I was kind of surprised to learn he's not a scientist or anything, because he certainly takes a scientific viewpoint and is so rigorous, but just independently educated and, a world traveler. Did we want to get into some of our favorite stories?
Sure.
Okay. Richard, did you want to start with one?
Let's start with the one that was his first story in this collection. I know that we probably all find it a favorite, but we started talking about it, and its name. Oh, I'm gonna have to look at the name again, or unless one of you wants to
Old
say
Faithful.
it. Old Faithful. That brings to mind. There we go. That brings to mind Yellowstone, where you have a geyser named Old Faithful. I'm sure that was a connection that was made there. But what is Old Faithful? It can be also a comet that is on a regular rotation around our sun. And that's part of this story as well. We talked briefly about a Martian who was the protagonist of a story. He's on his Mars is an old Mars that's a dying Mars. And they have some strange cultural rules around their resources where they can only live a certain amount of time as well. And this Martian is an astronomer, and eventually, using bright flashes of light, starts communicating with some people on Earth. And there is a friendship. There's quite a lengthy passage about how they start to communicate using math. And so there's, if you like that kind of a detail, it is a way that they broke through communication in the first contact. And this character, this Martian, is going to subvert his death by seeing if he can catch the comet and use it to fling himself towards Earth to meet up with his friends on Earth. And I think that I don't think
And
that spoils the story at all, but it's an interesting concept, and I found the ending to be quite satisfying and quite emotional in its own way. And so that to me is an example where what I was talking about, that I thought his characters were a little stilted or language a little stilted. I think this is an exception. And this story was from
yeah,
1934. Uh, and it was just fascinating, and a great read, a great opening story.
Yeah, and it wasn't really a happy ending necessarily. I didn't really see it coming, but it was a fitting ending and it made you think. It was a great story.
and just the fact that it was a very early, if not one of the, well, maybe the first truly empathetic, uh, human-like sort of alien. And he peppered in a couple things there to really make you feel for it. The creature whose name was 779 or something, 774.
774.
774. Yeah.
Yeah. And I liked that, his mission was not to try to save his people or his planet. It was just scientific curiosity. Like if I'm going out anyways, I want to go out knowing like who I've made contact with and what it's like on that planet. I want to know. And I'm not well read in the pulp era stuff yet, but I have to figure that's one of the first examples of this kind of character and intentional efforts to make you sympathetic. Like there's a random passage thrown in where before he decides to do this, he actually goes back to a sort of infirmary and visits like his offspring. And it's like a touching moment. And you're like, oh, okay. Like I didn't expect something like that. And I liked it because it's like, okay, it almost foreshadows something bad's going to happen because we're being made to feel for this character. But I really enjoyed it. It's one of those examples where I feel like the alien was more fleshed out than the human characters.
And if you like ideas, just the idea in 1934 of finding a way to hitch a ride with a comet, and their technology wasn't so that they could actually take a spaceship to Earth. This was a
No,
real risky
it
venture that
was.
he was making.
He basically fashioned a surface to orbit something. And once he got to Earth orbit, somehow landed.
And
Yeah,
it was
a
a
really
crash landing
cool.
too.
Yeah, and not much. Well, sparse world building, but you kind of got the impression that maybe this was a decadent society. Like he's living in the middle of the desert, but he has his own mansion of sorts with all sorts of projects. I kind of get the feeling everybody's kind of doing their own thing. And, when your time's up, your time's up, unless you're contributing. And, it's ironic. He's not contributing to society, even though his endeavors could have led to, a potential first contact and a saving of. Actually, we should mention there's two sequel stories, neither of which I've read. Did you guys know that?
No, I
Oh,
knew that there were sequels, but I haven't read them.
okay. And I believe they involve the son of the protagonist, which I assume would be the character in that infirmary. So, and I don't think he wrote it knowing he was going to do a sequel. So people wanted it and were asking for it. And I guess that's how he went about it because he'd already, I guess I kind of spoiled part of the ending, but yeah, that's pretty neat. I need to track those down and read the sort of Old Faithful trilogy.
Well, he was
And
23 years old when he first wrote this. So if he got something that had a success and they said, we want more, I'm going to write more. I'm going to sell another
Yeah.
story here. Sure. So I can
And
see why there's some sequels. I'm
we
not sure
should
if I even
mention,
want to seek them out though. This story stands so well on its own.
I can't see them being better. Of course not. But I'm a completionist. I have to finish a sort of world I've started. But we should mention in the afterword, because he kind of describes what life was like for him when he wrote each of these. And at the time he was, quite young. Did you say 20?
I think he's 23. I think it's 1911 he was born, and this was
Yeah.
1934.
And he's working across the road from his house in a hemp factory. And he's describing walking home at the end of each night in a snowstorm, possibly accidentally stoned as a byproduct of working there. So who's to say if he hallucinated the story in the first place? And I thought that was funny. I don't know if he was trying to be serious or just making a joke. But I thought that was really neat because he described kind of walking across, in the dark in a snowstorm, kind of imagining an otherworldly landscape while also maybe a bit stoned. I thought that was pretty neat. And he also described that job as the rottenest job he ever had, which I thought was
he
good.
said it would be cold when you go grab the stalks of hemp, and then you'd go take it to the machine that was like 100 degrees, or the temperature differential was insane, going back and forth all day.
Yeah. So yeah, it was a pretty strong start, and I guess the most logical story to start, as it was his landmark and the one he's best known for.
Yeah.
And I think the stories were listed chronologically. So that was his first major hit.
Yeah. I don't know how many things he had published between 29 and 34.
He had a lot.
Was it? Okay.
Like I looked at a list of his stories on a site, and I would bet that he may have had over 100 short stories by the time he rolled around into the mid 1950s.
Jeez, see that? And it frustrates me that they're not easily, well, I want an omnibus, basically. Somebody's got to
Nefsa Press.
Pardon?
We need Nefsa Press to put together.
Should send them.
That's going to be a very big book, though.
Well, they can do volumes. They've done volumes before, multiple volumes. Yeah, so I think that was probably a favorite of all three. Ira, did you want to talk about one of your favorites?
Sure. Probably my favorite short story out of this one, and maybe even a favorite that I've read in a while, is The Lotus Engine. And this story was less than 20 pages long, and it was about a couple astronauts who were kind of out scavenging for relics or whatever, and they find themselves on one of Jupiter's moons, Io. And at first they don't really see much, and then they go underground and they find this kind of lost civilization that has been gone for, they speculate, like 1,000,000 years or something like that. And they see mummies of these creatures that they kind of say are humanoid, or they almost even call them humans, but they're described differently. I forget the exact descriptions that he did of them. They're like gnome-like, or
maybe humanoid-ish.
Yeah. And so you're not quite sure if they're aliens or some old branch of humanity or something. But they then discover, and they thought they hit the jackpot. There's all these relics they're going to be able to take back to Earth. But they discover this big machine outside that kind of had gotten buried by a landslide. So they do all this work to dig it out, and their curiosity gets at them, and they say, we got to turn this thing on and see what it does. And they turn it on, and it's got this automation that these mirrors open up, and it tracks the sun, and everything starts working. And there's these power cables that go down into something that they're not sure of. And right off the bat, they start kind of feeling funny. And then they kind of start hallucinating. And the main character, he starts hallucinating first, and he starts seeing the civilization as it was when it was vibrant and alive. And he asks his buddy, and he doesn't see it at first, but almost from him mentioning it, he starts then hallucinating the same thing. And they get to the point where they see this lake there, and they see these creatures running around, and everything's like back in order. And they say, hey, let's go swimming, and they look down and they're wearing swimming shorts, and they were in spacesuits with, protection from the elements. And they start realizing that this is all in their head. And his older partner starts kind of raising the red flag a little bit sooner, but they get really caught up in this. And they even get to the point where they can start hallucinating other things that have happened on Earth to them. Or he said, if you even think of like a Roman setting and you know enough about it, there it was, like right in front of you. And I kind of, I wouldn't say that spoils anything. You got to know that about the story. But the one thing I won't spoil is they realize that whatever created this machine was doing it to kind of appease their population as they were going down and declining. And it's a really interesting theme that you see all the time now, and we live it. And this was written in 1940, and it was 20 pages long. And how well he fleshed that idea out was just amazing. And so it gets to the end where these two astronauts basically realize they got to put an end to this machine, or they're just going to give in to this because it's so pleasurable and it's so easy to just give in. And they know that they would end up dying because of this.
It immediately brought to mind The Last Days of Chanticleer by Lee Brackett.
Yeah.
Which, the last remnants of a civilization kind of living in a virtual reality of the past around them.
Yeah.
Yeah. To kind of make the end a little better. Yeah. It was really good. It almost felt like touches of new wave-ish.
Yeah.
But, way earlier.
Yeah. And like, I was thinking Philip K. Dick, and I saw some other people. I mean, he's just the most popular one that came up with some of these ideas, but
yeah,
this was in 1940.
it's a trope I love, like getting stuck in a virtual reality or a wish fulfillment sort of scenario, and then having to get out. Like, yeah, that one, I loved it.
Yeah, that was a really good one.
And as you were saying, Ira, there was a purpose to it. It was to allow this people to maximize their effort as their civilization was dying, to be able to prolong it as long as possible, because instead of being depressed and just giving up, they were in the most pleasurable mindset possible to just continue their work.
Yeah, they died with smiles on their faces, basically, I think was one of the things, which I'm not sure how you see that on a mummy, but maybe. But I looked it up. He kind of, I guess this is a theme that he went over a little bit more, and even explored in some other another short story in one of his later novels as well. So I'm gonna be reading those soon, and I thought it was great, way ahead of its time.
Yeah. I'm so glad you didn't pick the one I wanted to talk about. I don't know if I have a favorite, but the one I've chosen to talk about is Seeds of the Dusk, 1938, which is basically an alien invasion / first contact story. But I think it's in response to Stanley Weinbaum's The Lotus Eaters, which was a story about sentient plant life. But then Gallun read it, and he was pissed off that these plants had sentience, but there was no reason for them to, because they didn't move. They didn't have a purpose, really. And he wanted to make a story about a sentient plant that was plausible. And so you see his kind of hard SF mind working, trying to come up with a biology different than what we have here on Earth. And so the story starts with these spores from Mars kind of floating in between Mars and Earth. And this is kind of a dying Earth scenario. It's millions of years in the future. There's some kind of descendant of man. They're called humans, but they're not. So it's hard to tell. They're the only dominant species left, really, and there's not many of them left. And this plant spore kind of lands in the middle of nowhere and starts to germinate. And you just get multiple pages of this thing growing and developing the necessary sense organs and tools it needs in this alien environment. And then the story takes a really cool shift, and suddenly we're in the point of view of an intelligent crow named Ka, right? Ka?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm like, okay, this is taking a turn. This is going to be good. And being a crow, he's inquisitive, but he has the intelligence of maybe like a 10-year-old child or something, like a little smarter than today. And it investigates the plant, decides that this is a threat to its environment, but there's nothing he can do about it. He's just a crow with his other crows. So he goes to a human, and they have like an uneasy balance. They don't really get along, these intelligent animals and the last of the humans. But he's like, I need to warn the humans so they can take care of this threat, because my species is not really capable of that. I think that's what was happening.
Yeah.
And the human takes the advice of the warning, but does not care for the crow. Basically shoots Ka for dead and walks off and burns the plant, and that's that. And then we learn Ka is not dead, and he tries to travel back home and eventually collapses after days of struggle. And when he comes to, he's actually surrounded by these plants. There's more spores that weren't destroyed, and they have nurtured him back, kind of made him healthy again. And he's intelligent enough to know that this is not necessarily a good thing. These plants have ulterior motives or something, but at the same time, he's mildly maybe hypnotized or something. He's very calm. He doesn't really care. And the plant ends up using Ka as a tool to bring about I was going to say a first contact with humanity, but technically our human already went over and burned the one plant. But we kind of have a first contact, and then it's who's going to inherit the earth, kind of, the remnants of humanity or these invading plants. I've read about stuff like this many times, but reading it this early on, like, it's just so much more exciting to me when you put it in context. People hadn't really written stuff this good yet, I think. Not that I've come across. I'm not going to spoil how it ends. I loved it. I did not expect to be in the head of a crow at the end of the Earth, a dying Earth story. It was really good.
Yeah,
a different type of invasion.
Yeah, and the humans are in the midst of migrating to Venus in this time.
Yeah.
And this
Because
spore
Venus is kind of like a new Earth now.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
with the dying sun.
Yeah, the cool thing about these plants is, at the end of the day, they're still a vegetable intelligence. They can only really dominate a passive world, or a world that's kind of nearing its end. And that's the case with Earth. There's not many humans left, and they're looking to move on anyway.
Mars kind of became inhabitable to them, so they're moving.
And I think they came from Ganymede or something first. Like, we hear about these plants traveling only when a planet is easily submissive, I guess. Then they try to, inhabit it.
Yeah, that was
really cool. When the planet's on its last legs, they have an opportunity to take it over.
Like, now we have the might to possibly take this place over. Yeah. Really cool. Like, he's not the best at show don't tell. A lot of times he is just spouting it off. Yet I guess because of the time it was written, I'm fascinated to read about it. Just like in Old Faithful, I've read 100 times 2 different species learning to communicate, but it wasn't a trope at the time that he wrote it. So it was really, really cool.
And he has a knack for looking at characters and creating characters that are protagonists that aren't human. In fact, humans are often the either inadvertent or on purpose villain's not the right word, but antagonist of some sort in the piece.
Occasionally the villain, but and that, I don't think that was happening a lot then either. Alien protagonists.
Yeah, I don't think John W. Campbell liked that type of writing. I know he turned
No.
down an Asimov story because Asimov had the aliens like more intelligent than the humans.
And Campbell was very much humanity has to be the all-conquering,
Yeah.
all-powerful.
Yep.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, that was a good one.
Yeah, that one took me by surprise. I guess you could say that was a hostile alien, but at the end of the day, it did away with a more hostile presence and kind of brought about a new piece, maybe, sort of. I don't want to really spoil how it ends, but
yeah,
I really enjoyed it.
It was almost like indifferent to it. It was just doing its thing. Like it wasn't vindictive or.
And sometimes
Now the
it's almost
crow,
like,
the crow was seeking revenge.
yeah, I like that. Yeah. But it's almost like sometimes Gallun will take you aside and be like, now we don't know for sure what's going on in this alien's mind, but it could be that this is its point of view. Or he did that a lot in Old Faithful, where he'd kind of pull you aside and be like, now, if you saw this creature, you might be horrified, but just think what you would look like to it. And I was like, this is so neat. He's he's kind of stopping the story to just point stuff out and make you empathize more and more.
And I think that word empathy is a big one in terms of what he does. Instead of us having to be the hero, we try to put ourselves in the shoes of something else. And I say something because of Alien.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he also, he almost had, we haven't read a lot of his stories yet, but he seems to have a no nonsense attitude for space travel. Like, faster than light is not going to happen. So most of these stories take place in the solar system, which I think is also really cool. There's maybe one or two stories in here that it doesn't really say whether or not the planetoid we're on is in our solar system, but I also liked that he was so no nonsense. Like, now it's not plausible, so it's not happening. Richard, did you want to talk about a favorite?
Sure. I was thinking while you were talking about this, there's a few themes that I saw through some of the stories. There was that theme of empathy. There was also a theme about, or the fact that Mars or Venus, or perhaps the asteroids had been a planet at some time. Those things were present, and that was very present in the 1930s in all the fiction that was out there. But there's also a theme that the story that Ira talked about was abandoned old technology. And I'll talk about the story named Derelict. Derelict is a story of a person who has a backstory of his own, which is very sad, of his wife and child dying, and comes upon this derelict spaceship out in space that is not human. It is coming upon an alien ship that has been inoperative for a long time. And once again, this spaceship starts up, and in some ways, there's a bit of a robotic type of presence with this spaceship. And as this person starts to find purpose in exploring the spaceship and seeing if he can get it charged up, this entity is befriending and in some ways helping him work through his grief. And it goes to a place where he has to decide what he's going to do at the end. Is he going to stay with this alien ship, or would he return to his own ship and perhaps to humanity? And it was satisfying both in exploration of an alien vessel, but also in an exploration of this person's grief.
Yeah, and like, who is writing about an alien robot caring about healing, another alien's soul? It's very, I was so taken aback. Like, I did not expect this kind of stuff. It was so good.
Yeah, and he gives him like this gift of the ship could leave the solar system. He could be the first one, and there was, I forget the prize or whatever was almost promised to him. Maybe just the fame of this, but like Richard said, there was this other thing happening where he had another obligation in a way, and he had to make his decision. And The end was really good too, because I guess we won't spoil it. It's doesn't need to be spoiled, but that artificial intelligence or robot or whatever we want to call it, he gives them kind of a little out at the end of it too. So
Yeah, I thought that was a cool touch,
yeah,
which made
that
me
was a
want a
great one.
sequel. Honestly, I wanted more.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe there were.
Yeah, there could have
I
been.
don't think so, though.
We want to just kind of talk in general about some of the others?
I think
Um,
Ira has potentially for another one too, right?
oh
We're going to
yes, this is
second
true.
round.
Yeah, one that kind of took me aback, and it was Prodigal Son or Prodigal Aura, and it was, I mean, there was a sort of science fiction element to it. There definitely was, but the story was just really about people and the differences between people and getting over grudges. And it was, I felt like it was more literary fiction the way he wrote that one than science fiction, and it just stood out to me as a bit different. And it's really just a story about this farmer in the future who has a family, and his brother-in-law had been traveling the solar system and getting all this fame and everything, and he kind of has this envy in a way for him because he has this real nonchalant attitude, and he'll come back and show them the artifacts he's found on wherever he's been traveling, and the whole family just adores him and loves him. And he's, the main character, he's there working on the farm every day. And this brother-in-law of his is coming back, and he has some luggage with him, and he kind of spills some seeds out, and it happens to be a Martian like apple plant, and it starts kind of like infecting everything. And he kind of gets in trouble because they theorize this could end up like wiping out. It could be very invasive, and they're not sure how invasive it could be. So they gotta do something with this. And the way our main character approaches this, he could have just turned him in and threw him under the bus, but he kind of approaches it in a very empathetic way, and you see him grow almost, and you see the kind of douchey brother-in-law grow through it. And then the ending is just kind of sweet with the guy and his wife. The whole thing of that one, I didn't really expect to like it when I first started reading it, but I just kind of like sucked me into that one.
And it definitely ties to the prodigal son from the Bible story. If people aren't familiar with it, uh, a son asks for his inheritance and takes it from his father. His brother stays home with his father to work on a farm. He goes out, he blows it, and he decides, I'm going to come back and see if they'll accept me. And so uh, he comes back. His father adores that he's home again, but his brother's resentful that they throw this big feast for him. And so the idea that the brother-in-law could be very resentful of this famous astronaut type brother of his wife coming home and everybody in his family adoring him. And he's kind of like, hey, I'm the person who's here, who's taking care of our family. And yet everybody's, doting on this guy. You can see the parallels in terms of emotionally from the biblical story to this story. But of course, the plants and some of the things that happen illustrate a really positive view of humanity and families.
Yeah, it was a feel-good one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it was, 15 to 20 years after. Well, maybe not quite so much, but that one was from, let me see, 1951.
1951. Yeah.
So, and I think in the afterword, he mentions kind of coming back after a little bit and kind of changing his focus to more, something like more human stories sort of thing.
Well, he had also come back from a period of about 8 years with World War II where he hadn't been writing. And so you can even think of the return of the soldiers, etc., from the war and the type of receptions they would receive.
And also interesting, he had a couple periods of just no writing for quite a while in his life, and then came back into it up until the 80s, like 70s, 80s. I know Ira had mentioned a book, The Eden Cycle was one of his last.
77, I think.
Yeah, and I think he had 2 more after that.
Had to go out and
Um,
get it.
and interestingly, I bought this analog a while back, not for the Gallun. I didn't know who Gallun was at the time, but he's in here. And at the end of his story, which is not in our collection, so I will be reading it, there's actually, look at his cheery face. There's a
No,
There he
little,
is.
there's a little write up, and at the end of it, it says, um, there's just a little biography by someone named J.K. Klein. At the end of it, though, it says, and his most recent book was Eden Cycle for Ballantine in 74. This is
74.
from 1980. But it says, if any publisher can summon up the courage to handle a manuscript of 1,400 pages, Ray has a novel about a science fiction writer. Now, I looked into it. It was never published. So it's like somewhere there's this massive manuscript about a science fiction writer, and it just didn't get published from what I can tell. Because he had 2 novels come out after the Eden Cycle, and they are not about a science fiction writer.
Some of our viewers are really knowledgeable. So if you know where there's the archives in maybe a university of Raymond Z
Yeah,
Gallun, let us know.
I
I've even
Oh,
remember.
I
had
said it Z instead of Z. Sorry.
I've had a couple like ancestors of some of these authors comment on my videos. They might have like a, some sort of keyword. If a keyword gets hit, then they get an email. And someone watched one of my videos for George R. Stewart. I think it was his granddaughter. So if any of his relatives know where that manuscript is, we might be interested.
Yeah, I think it'd be fascinating.
And I was mentioning this to Matt earlier today, that I was looking to see if there was videos about Raymond Z Gallun on YouTube, and there were audiobook versions of some of his stories. That's an accessible area if some of you are looking for that. And there was a podcast that was on there, but I never saw any video like this discussing his work. So
No,
he's definitely an author that can be discovered or
and rightly
rediscovered.
so. Like,
And
I
should be.
guess the significance, like the introduction mentioning he being one of the top 3 revolutionaries. I was like, okay, well, where have I been? Admittedly, I'm new to the older stuff, but
Yeah,
I'd never
and
heard of him. And as I said, there's not videos out there about him.
yeah, I have ordered, I think, an obscure magazine from the UK. There's an interview, but I think it's an excerpt from his autobiography, which I would love to read someday. But that'll probably shed some light on him, and I'll probably mention it in a future video. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like I romanticize these people of the past. Like, I want to know more. I got so interested in C.L. Moore and Henry Kuttner's life, like Brackett and Hamilton, and people like this. Neil R. Jones, who I'd mentioned to you before, Richard, who to these really silly, simple robot stories, but so endearing to read stuff like that from the time. And another one who's not well known, but Stanley Weinbaum was also new to me, and just these best ofs are definitely serving their purpose. Well, I don't think they were meant to be rediscoveries, at the time, but they're certainly serving a purpose now. I'm so happy we read this.
yeah, and oh, go ahead. Were you going to go over your?
No, you can go.
Statement? I was just going to say there was 13 stories in here. Like we all said, they seem like they were written more recently than the 30s and 40s and 50s. And out of all those 13, there was really only 2 that I thought were okay. All the rest of them I thought were fabulous, and some of them just amazing, so we won't be able to talk about all of them here, but like there's so many good ones in here.
Yeah, the only one I didn't really totally enjoy was 1951, The Restless Tide.
Yeah.
Which was just kind of exploring the idea of humanity kind of being restless and never, what if humanity can never find fulfillment? How would you deal with that? But I don't know. I wish it was told a different way. I didn't really like how it was explored between a husband and a wife, kind of lamenting their boring lives. I don't know.
Yeah.
I like the idea a lot. There's hundreds of different high-tech ways you could get around that. But that was the only story that I really didn't absolutely love.
And yet there's people who have acclaimed it in some of the reviews I watched, read, as a great story. I'm with you, Matt. It didn't work as well for me, but there
Yeah,
are definitely people who like it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was short. It had a point. It was better than a lot of the other short stories I think we've read, but when you put it in context with all these other ones, it was one of the weakest. And also Hotel Cosmos, that one had an interesting idea, but it was kind of one of my least favorite.
Agreed. Yeah. It was okay. I liked that you have this interspecies hotel. There's a conference of some sort. All these different aliens come from all different parts of the galaxy. They've all got to be put in their specialized environments. And then they attend the convention by teleprompter anyway. they all just take little robots and talk to each other with those. So
Yeah.
it's like, it's kind of funny. Like, why'd you even bother making the trip?
Speed of light, Matt.
Yeah. Another one I kind of wanted to talk about was, because it's just so different than anything else I've kind of read. If I can find it, Davy Jones' Ambassador.
Yeah.
Had like a biological iPad in it for communication, which I thought was so cool.
Yeah.
Did you guys like that one? Did you want to talk about
Yeah.
that one?
I did too. And that, once again, that's a very interesting alien contact, but it was an alien contact deep in our oceans.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess you wouldn't say alien.
Yeah.
An alien
felt
or
like
an
it.
intelligence here on Earth that we're not aware of.
Right.
But also an exploration of how would you go about being a civilized, intelligent society without fire? How do you what's the alternative technology you could use? And again, we get lots of early examples of bioengineering, but the way that the creatures communicated really blew my mind. It was so prescient, right?
Yeah, and you got empathy. Like the human became almost the victim, and you got empathy from these creatures towards this human, which I didn't really see coming. And it was
I think, Matt, you need to describe perhaps the part where the human is captured by these creatures in the ocean.
Yeah,
but
he's in a submarine and has some
there's a
sort of accident.
problem in terms of whether he'll ever get to go back to be with other humans again. And maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, so it starts out he's in an exploratory sub and has an issue. And it's not looking like he's going to survive. And then he's kind of carried off by what looks like maybe squid holding technology, maybe. And he ends up waking up kind of in like an underwater dome. It's not transparent, but there are windows. And he's kind of, it's almost H.P. Lovecraft. There's these scary, underwater creatures looking at him.
Yeah.
And just observing him. And he's kind of in one room with the sub, and then there's another room for him to relax in, but it's just full of human relics that these intelligent fish and stuff have found and kind of kept to kind of learn as much as they can, including a couple corpses. But now they have a live human to study. And it really takes a turn when this fish, which is basically a biological iPad, presses up against the window and text shows up. And another entity, which calls itself the student, says, hey, human, I'm on my way to meet you. Don't die yet. I want to study with you or learn with you. So I guess that gives him a reason to keep going. There's a mystery here. And the way he gets out of this predicament, which is basically confinement, they're going to study him, comes about in a way I didn't expect. Again, I was going to say empathy, but actually, I don't think the student had empathy. It was more, and he says it at the end,
It was
he's
selfish.
a curious creature. Yeah, he wants a shellfish or selfish. He did it for himself, kind of thing. It was very cool. Again, you get, it's not an alien, but it's an intelligent alien who's working with a human.
Well, our human protagonist looks like he's a goner. This is like
Yeah,
a zoo to observe him till he dies. But the
yeah.
student,
Basically,
but
he's
the
here till
student and
he.
this and the humans create a relationship, and there is a way for him to be removed from the zoo. I'm
Yes,
not sure
that
zoo is the right
was.
word. The laboratory, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, observation chamber. I don't know. It was,
Yeah.
but it got very cosmic horror feeling with all these creepy creatures looking at him and stuff. And written in a time when there was less known about the ocean too, which just makes it all the more exciting for me. I have no trouble putting my mind in the context of the time it was written, and just enjoying it as if I was a 15-year-old who just bought this magazine and having my mind blown.
Yeah. I guess I should mention too, if we look at the cover art of this edition, see if I can focus. It's still focusing on my head here. There we go. This is from the story The Shadow of the Veil. And this is an interesting story. It almost, I won't go into detail, but it puts almost like our two humans as villains in this one. And they are pretty villainous. And this statue that they're using in that cover art to kind of fool these aliens, it was a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that's the story they chose to illustrate.
Yeah.
It was not one of my favorites. It kind of felt like a Hal Clement story,
Yeah.
with a twist, a scientific twist. It was good, but it was nowhere near one of the best. But yeah, we should, because it does seem like each of these covers, at least for the paperbacks, does represent a story so far.
Yeah.
Which is very cool.
And the same artist, let me see his name here again, is
H.R. Van Dongen.
That's the one.
Yep.
H.R. Van Dongen.
You see his name a lot on these vintage science fiction cover art.
Yeah. What I like about it though is obviously he's read the stories that he's creating the artwork for too.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I now every time we're reading one of these, each story, I'm like, okay, is this the cover art? Like, and it took me a while to realize which one this was when I was reading it.
Yeah.
I have such a beat up copy. I will be definitely on the lookout for a new one because this was definitely one of my favorite reads. Ever.
Yeah, I kind of like it when you get a book club edition or even an alternate cover because they usually pick one of the other stories and then you can kind of compare the cover art to those. But this one, there was quite a few of these out of this 21 that didn't get a book club edition.
Yeah, and this is one of those.
And this is one that didn't, which is too bad. I would have liked to have that one too.
I was thinking maybe we should just quickly mention a couple other stories just because there's so many good ones in here. I think we had mentioned about nanotechnology. I think you're thinking of A Menace in Miniature.
Yep.
Where we have some astronauts on a planet. This is a planet outside of Earth's solar system, I believe, if I remember right. And or is it Mars?
It's a fragment of a world that is traveling through our solar system.
Yeah,
that's right. And the astronauts are mysteriously dying, and they find pinprick holes in their spacesuits that are killing them, and they're trying to protect themselves and figure where they'll be safe from whatever this is that's killing them. And it goes into a very interesting place. I don't know if I should really say too much more. That's the mystery of it. But we discover something very interesting about the former civilization of this planet.
And the way he approaches nanotechnology is cool because it's like they create small, like little robots, right? Wasn't it robots? And then they have those robots create smaller robots. And then those robots create smaller.
All just while these two guys are locked in one room and they just happen to have everything they need to do this.
Yeah.
But it was funny to see the scientist. He's like, now I just need to, you could imagine him with these glasses, magnifying glasses, just making smaller and smaller robots. And now he's piloting, a robot the size of a speck of dust, so he can find whatever this threat is. It was very cool.
So a lot, I guess, wasn't known about like neutron stars at the time. And the story Godson of Al-Murla, I think.
Marlu.
Yeah. 1936. And he envisions kind of a very dense asteroid that I forget the elements he cites in this, but it's the idea of the gravitational force based on something so dense coming near us and what it would do to the planet Earth. And that one was blowing my mind for like kind of a hard science story.
That, and it turned into like an epic thriller. Like the means of escaping annihilation, I thought was really cool.
You know, it felt to me thematically like, I'm not sure if any of you've read this, but Neil Stephenson's Seven Eves talked about the moon breaking up and destroying Earth, but people are in orbit and some people on the moon, and can they survive, and can humanity survive? This, I think the inspiration could have come from this story with this neutron-like item going through space, Earth going to be buying it, but there's an opportunity to save our people somehow so that there's still a civilization of Earth, but not on Earth. And I don't think I'll go further in what happens in there, but I'm just going, wow. I think Neil Stephenson took this germ of an idea here for his novel.
Yeah, and how our main character gets the idea to save part of humanity, the mystery that it revolves around that. I mean, for a short story, this has a lot of this has a lot of cool concepts in a single short story.
And he jokes in the afterword, he may have accidentally discovered neutron stars.
Yeah.
When he, he wrote about a fictional thing that was later discovered, which I love that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think it was like neutronium, or he kind of, I don't know if that was a real element that he speculated on, but.
And he used it to describe what brought about the asteroid belt in our solar system in the past, which was also really cool.
He might not have been like a true scientist, but he definitely had a good grasp on gravity and the, orbital mechanics and stuff. That was a theme in a lot of his stories.
And for those scientists for those scientists or historians out there, 1937 this story was published.
I don't know if it was in the afterword or somewhere else I read a snippet of him talking, but he does mention like enjoying nature and kind of staring at things and wanting to know how they work and enjoying how they work, and then extrapolating that to, fictional things that could work. I don't know. I'm romanticizing of a time when we weren't all connected, there was no media. So these ideas were fresh for the first time kind of thing. How do you come up with stuff like this when you're working in a hemp factory with no electricity in your own home? He wrote Old Faithful by candlelight. Like,
it's amazing when he tells us about that.
Yeah.
He's a comical old man. Like,
everybody should go seek this out. This is such a good book, such a good collection of stories.
Yeah, I guess we usually end by saying, who would you recommend this to? And I feel like if you have any interest in science fiction whatsoever, aside from older prose, like he covers so many things that are covered across future decades of science fiction, except he's doing it sometimes for the first time, which is really cool to me.
In some ways, he reminded me a bit of Hal Clement, but better, that there was more intriguing ideas. And
he was very concerned with sense of wonder.
Yeah.
Which you'd get less of from Hal Clement, I guess, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
But he had that, some people would call it a hard science fiction edge to it, that for the vast majority of stories, you're going to have some passages that are trying to explain what's going on here scientifically. But then back into that story, back into that plot, and that was very satisfying.
It's very ahead of his time, writing believable hard SF before such a genre existed. And not a scientist, just somebody who had no nonsense for, it must be plausible. I just love that. I'll be seeking out a lot more. Obviously, with older authors like this, it's damn hard to find a lot of their stories. The best I could find was this print on demand. It's just called Raymond Gallun Science Fiction Collection. It's only 5 stories. I think it was $18 on Amazon, but you know, sometimes it'll say from other sellers, and somebody was selling it for $7 free shipping. So I picked that up. It's terrible quality, but I'm happy to have. It's 250 pages, so these might be more so novellas. The Revolt of the Starmen, Comet's Burial, Asteroid of Fear, Stamped Caution, Big Pill, and The Eternal Wall.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be looking for more. And like I showed you guys, I did find this novel from 1974.
Did you get that off eBay?
Yeah, that one did. Yeah.
So there was one on
after
eBay
I got into this, I checked my local bookstores because he was someone I wasn't ever really looking for.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went around and checked and I didn't see him anywhere. So I went ahead and bought it.
There was one on eBay that was quite affordable and it had one other watcher, and I waited too long and it disappeared. And I just thought, I wonder if that was Ira.
That was probably me.
How many people are tracking down this book right now?
Yeah. And it was in like perfect condition, very
That's
good
probably
price.
the one.
And I think in the afterword, didn't he say that he thought that might have been his best novel, at least up to that point? I mean, it had only been published a few years before this best of collection in his afterword. But
yeah, I
he
think
was praising it.
2 novels after that. And I know he married his high school sweetheart 40 years after running back into her. So I believe he was in his 70s. And he did some more traveling. He jokes he's traveled in the end of the afterword. He jokes he's traveled pretty much everywhere but Antarctica, and hopefully he'll make it. And I did read online that he did make it to Antarctica at age 80. Now, I can't prove the source I read. It's just a random post on the internet, but I think that's pretty cool.
We'll go with
traveled
it.
all over. He visited Clark in Sri Lanka, where Clark lived for the last years of his life. Like, really cool stuff. Like Richard said, it's almost golden age before the golden age. I was blown away. It gets me so excited to keep reading these best ofs. Which actually brings to question, whose turn is it to pick the next read, and have you picked one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I know, Matt, you picked Raymond Gallun thinking it could be a dud. And so I'm doing one that I think could be a dud. El Sprague de Camp.
Okay. Just going to grab something off my shelf.
So, best of El Sprague de Camp. I've read a couple of his stories. I don't have high hopes for it, but I still think he's got some kind of weird absurdity that he'll throw into his stories sometimes.
Well, it looks like we'll have a dragon in the story from the cover.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought I had my hardcover close to hand, but I don't. But it has incredible cover art, as Ira pointed out once.
Yeah.
But that's cool. I don't think I've read a short story or anything from him.
I haven't read anything since I returned to science fiction. I do remember reading a couple stories, perhaps in the late 70s or early 80s.
His most popular is probably Less Darkness Falls, which is kind of an absurd time travel story. I've read that one, and then I've read Rogue Queen, which is about these aliens on a planet that are kind of like a beehive-like mentality. Very, very pulpy. But I figured we'll go with this one.
He wrote a lot of pseudo science fiction novels that were somewhat connected, and I can't tell you what the series was called or any of the names of the novels, but I have them. I saved them because I think it's a type of future history, which I'm very interested in. But I also know he's well known for the Enchanter stuff, which I do have close to hand. So if I enjoy the best of, this has been recommended to me by Steve, a law bookseller. Certainly more known than our friend Gallun here.
Yeah.
Who I beg you, if you're watching, to check this author out if you can find his stuff.
Yeah, and just to note too, I looked on Amazon like what is out there, and they have a lot of free ebooks that you can just get of a lot of his short stories.
And
Yeah, which is
archive.org is a library online that you can sign up for, and you can get PDF. You can have a time limit of having a PDF of these type of books. So you can look them up and
okay.
read them online.
Awesome.
Archive.org.
Yeah, and I'm sure some of his are on Project Gutenberg as well. So
Mhm.
I think he doesn't really have an estate that's locking stuff down and seeking it out. So there's a lot for free.
In short, I feel a little frustrated that he's fallen into obscurity, but like Richard said, we're kind of blazing into new territory here online. There doesn't seem to be many discussions, even solo reviews or anything. So um, at least this will be out there now for
Yeah.
people to find their way to him.
Yeah. I mean, I
Recommend
was
it.
kind of looking, I have a list. I think we touched on every single story except for maybe one or two. And the other one that I really liked was called Magician of Dream Valley. And it was very similar to the Lotus engine, where there was something doing broad mind control on some people. And it was just
Yeah.
another one of those. When I was reading it, I'm thinking he wrote these in the 30s. And then when we get to the afterwards and he's talking about working in a hemp plant and possibly being stoned, I'm like, okay, maybe it makes a little more sense.
He also wrote, I forget which story it was, but he said he put the exact address in New Orleans where he was while he was
Yeah.
writing it. And he
Yeah.
mentioned that it probably has like historic status and he hopes it's never torn down and still standing. So of course I hopped on Google Maps and I looked it up, and it's like a tavern / hotel now. But he made a joke that I hope it's still standing years from now, and that in some small way my specter can haunt a small corner of that building, something like that, which I thought was so funny.
Yeah, I guess if you do find this book, read the foreword. It doesn't really spoil anything, I don't think. And then definitely read the afterword. Sometimes, people will skip those things, but they added a lot of context to the whole collection.
Yeah, this intro did not really go into spoiler territory for many of the stories, which was good.
It really got me pumped for it, like you said.
He comes out of the gate saying this is one of the big time top 3 who changed the genre, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
And it's so good that in this best of series, so many of the authors were still alive to give that afterward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was just the right timing for this series to come out.
Yeah.
And I think even in the 70s, he was still recently getting awards and recognition, but I think he was still somewhat obscure or becoming obscure. And yeah, I don't think he ever pushed for fame or acknowledgement, and
Didn't
just seemed
seem
like a
like he
humble,
cared.
good guy
Yeah. Just a top-notch dude.
with, a passion for trying to get you to think about different ways of thinking about alien life, and just, I think he was very concerned about the future of humanity and the planet.
Yeah.
And it comes through his stuff.
Actually, there is a really great quote that I actually marked down. Now that you brought it up, I was just going to leave it lie, but you're saying about the concern of humanity. On page 309, at the end of a story, it says, mankind was like a rough, sturdy plant, growing, thrusting, crude but magnificent, and caught between rot and fire. And I just thought, wow, that summarized a lot of how he did his stories about humanity.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like he was just thinking differently than most other writers at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great pick, Matt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My favorite one so far.
Let us hope we have another one down the road like that.
Maybe
all right, so next video.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe not a
Next video, like I said, will be on Ira's channel roughly a month from now. And it'll be Elsprague de Camp. So thanks for joining me, guys. This was a lot of fun. It's always fun. And I look forward to our next one.
Yeah.
So,
and just a reminder, we all have playlists of these, so
yes,
you
we
can
do.
find them in there too. So
yeah, it took a while for me to get on board, but yes, I got a playlist.
Okay.
So check us out. Check out the rest of the series and follow us on our journey. Thanks for watching.